In the world of high finance and respectable city offices, the day usually begins with a ritual as old as England itself. The morning tea. But at Consolidated Investments, this comforting routine was about to be shattered by a grim and peculiar tragedy. It started with Miss Summers, a typist known for never quite getting the kettle to boil, and Miss Grosvenor, a glamorous secretary who treated her boss's tea like a sacred offering. But on this particular morning, something was terribly wrong. Mr. Rex Fortescue, the firm's tyrannical boss, drank his tea, and moments later, the office was thrown into chaos as he collapsed in agony, his body convulsing in a way that terrified his staff. By the time Inspector Neal arrived, the diagnosis was clear and shocking. Taxine poisoning, derived from the berries or leaves of the yew tree. It was a violent, painful end for a man who, as the inspector soon learned, was not exactly beloved. Rex Fortescue was a bully, a man who had made enemies in business and created a toxic atmosphere in his own home, Yew Tree Lodge. But the strangest detail wasn't the poison. It was what the police found in the dead man's pocket. It wasn't a wallet or a letter, but a handful of loose grain. Rye, to be exact. It seemed like a nonsensical detail, a bizarre touch that defied explanation. The inspector moved his investigation to the Fortescue family estate, Yew Tree Lodge, a place that felt less like a home and more like a pretentiously built mansion surrounding an ancient yew tree. Here, the suspects were as varied as they were suspicious. There was Adele, Rex's second wife, a woman 30 years his junior, who was clearly more interested in money, and her golf partner, Mr. Vivian Dubois, than her husband. There was Percival, the good son, a stingy and fastidious man who clashed with his father over the business. And then there was the prodigal son, Lance, who had been estranged in Africa but had suddenly returned, bringing his new, innocent wife, Pat, into this snake pit. As Inspector Neal probed deeper, the atmosphere in the house grew tense. The servants were on edge, particularly Gladys Martin, a naive and nervous parlor maid who seemed terrified of the police. And watching it all with a cool, detached amusement was Mary Dove, the housekeeper, who seemed to know where all the bodies were buried, but refused to hand over the shovel. The horror was far from over. Just as the family was reeling from Rex's death, the shadow of the nursery rhyme began to darken the house. Sing a song of sixpence, a pocket full of rye. The king, Rex, had been in his counting house, and soon the queen was in the parlor. Adele Fortescue sat down to tea in the library, eating scones and honey. Minutes later, she was dead, cyanide poisoning claiming her life just as swiftly as the taxine had taken her husband's. But the gruesome nursery rhyme demanded one more victim to complete its verse. The maid was in the garden hanging out the clothes. Gladys Martin, the frightened girl who had served the tea, went missing. Her body was found late that night, strangled, with a clothes peg clipped onto her nose, a cruel, mocking signature left by a killer who was playing a very sick game. It was this third murder, the senseless killing of the maid, that brought an avenging angel to Yew Tree Lodge. She didn't look like an avenger. She looked like a fluffy pink and white elderly lady. Miss Jane Marple had come because she had trained Gladys, and she was outraged by the cruelty of the clothes peg. While the police chased leads about blackmail and old family grudges involving a worthless gold mine called the Blackbird, Miss Marple sat quietly, knitting and watching. She saw what the police initially missed. She saw the dynamics between the brothers, Percival, the penny pincher, and Lance, the charming gambler. She spoke with the eccentric Aunt Effie and the terrified Jennifer, Percival's wife, and slowly, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together in her mind. She realized that the nursery rhyme wasn't the work of a madman, but a cold-blooded calculation designed to hide a very rational motive. Miss Marple sat down with Inspector Neal and unraveled the tangled skein. The Blackbird mine wasn't worthless. Uranium had been found there, making it worth a fortune, a secret known only to the brother who had been in Africa, Lance. The killer wasn't the obvious suspect. It was Lance, the charming prodigal son. He hadn't returned to reconcile with his father. He had come to eliminate him. Miss Marple explained how Lance had seduced the naive Gladys, using the fake name Albert Evans. He had manipulated her into putting the poison in the marmalade, telling her it was a truth drug that would help him get justice. The pocket full of rye was a distraction Lance had planted. He arrived just in time to kill Gladys, the only witness who could incriminate him, mocking her death to fit the rhyme. Then, he slipped the cyanide into his stepmother's tea, removing the other heir to the fortune. It was a plan of terrifying audacity, executed by a man who hid his evil behind a winning smile. In the end, Miss Marple returned to her quiet cottage, but the tragedy lingered. She opened a letter that had been lost in the mail, a letter from Gladys herself. Inside was a photograph of the maid with her young man, the handsome Albert Evans, who was, undeniably, Lance Fortescue. Gladys had died believing her lover was a hero, never knowing he was the monster who would end her life. Miss Marple looked at the photo with tears in her eyes, but also with a fierce sense of triumph. She held the evidence that would send a charming murderer to the gallows. The nice boy would pay for his crimes, and the maid in the garden would finally have her justice.